Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm glad to see all of you here. So, I'm Dakota Hudson. I am a student here at Dalton State and a participant in the STEM research program. To tell you a little bit about myself, as you probably figured out pretty quickly, I'm obsessed with dinosaurs and paleontology. So here's a lot of pictures of me out in the field and doing stuff in the lab. Also a couple pictures of me probably handling dangerous animals. So I basically got started doing paleontology when I was 3, when I saw Jurassic Park, as I've already said. And well, here we are. So moving on from here, I want to tell you about a unique opportunity that I got to go on this past June. Thanks to the help of Dr. Johnson and Dr. Warfinger, I got to go to Utah, Hanksville, Utah, to actually go dig up dinosaur bones. And as you can see, it was a big fun experience. So the Burpee Museum of Natural History in Illinois offers a scholarship to their quarry out in Hanksville to do this sort of thing. And so I got to win the scholarship. And so, as you can see, I did a lot of work while I was there, laying down next to the bone, you know. So the dig was led by Dr. Josh Matthews, this gentleman here in the pit, and this is intern and assistant Stu Cook. They led the dig, and at this quarry there were hundreds of dinosaur bones. They were everywhere, little fragments to full-size bones. They were just everywhere. And so many types of dinosaurs have been found here, including theropod dinosaurs, the carnivorous dinosaurs that includes T-Rex, Velociraptor, and today's birds. Ornithopods, small little plant eaters that had grinding teeth to chew their vegetation. Stegosaurs, the armored and plated dinosaurs. And most importantly, sauropods, the big long-necked dinosaurs. So, to tell you about a few of the things I got to do while I was out in Utah, for one, I got to dig. I did a lot of excavating. Let me tell you, that was a dirty job, but not as messy as plastering a jacket, as you can see. So once we get the bones out of the ground, we put them in protective layers of burlap, paper mache, and plaster of Paris, and that's a messy job. So that way the bones are protected while they're being transported to the laboratory to get cleaned up and studied. And one of the couple of things I got to do while I was there was I helped excavate a bone that was in the rock wall here. This little mass right here is the bone. And while I was on a hike in the area, I came across some possible footprints from a sauropod dinosaur. You can see this is the back foot. There's the forefoot, maybe. It could be just mud holes, but they're going to do some more research to find out for sure. That'd be pretty cool if they were, though. All right, so we're going to talk a bit about the quarry itself. So, the Hanksville Burpee Dinosaur Quarry was administered by the Bureau of Land Management, so it's a federal land. And it was discovered in 2007. There was rumors of dinosaur bones being found in the area. So the Burpee Museum sent out a team, and well, they found an entire bone bed. The Hanksville Burpee Quarry is perhaps one of the best places to find dinosaur bones. Thousands of bones have been excavated from this place. And over 15 different species of dinosaur have been discovered. So the museum, Burpee, it offers tours of the area for free. You can go pull up and then you can take a tour of the area. And they also allow people to go dig if you pay for it or if you win the scholarship like I did. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the geological context. Trust me, I promise we'll get to the dinosaurs, but this stuff is important to understand the sort of world they come from and the world they lived in. So the quarry is part of the famous Morrison Formation. And the Morrison Formation extends from Utah, Colorado, all the way to New Mexico and Arizona, in this general area. And you can see a more detailed map of the Morrison Formation here. So this is like one of the best formations in the entire world for dinosaurs. In fact, digs started here in the Morrison since the 1800s. And specifically, the Hanksville Burpee Quarry covers a specific part of the Morrison called the Brushy Basin Member. So, alrighty, here we go. Sorry y'all, I gotta keep walking back and forth. Alright, so a little bit more about the age and the strata. You can see the bands, these nice, neat bands of dark rocks, light rocks, and all that. This is the Brushy Basin. This is how we identify the Brushy Basin Member. And here's on this geological, on the geological column here, what's highlighted in blue. So it's one of the younger deposits of the Morrison Formation. So in terms of age, it dates back to the late Jurassic period, or about 146 to 156 million years ago. That's a long time. And so the rocks themselves is mostly conglomerate, or basically like a lot of pebbles and small rocks that are sort of glued together in a natural sort of cement. Also, there are sandstone layers as well. Sandstone being primarily where you find the dinosaur bones themselves. Let me tell you, the conglomerate is really hard to get through, especially with a little air drill, so I had to use a geologist's hammer to get through it. But, like I said, the strata itself can be distinguished by the brightly banded colors, so that makes it easy to find. Now, moving on to what was the environment like in the Morrison back when the dinosaurs roamed. And well, there was a variety of environments. So you would have swamps, lakeside environments, there was coastal environments. Also towards the southwest of the area, there was deserts, semi-arid areas, and some areas were very much like here, being like a natural floodplain area. And that's where the quarry was actually part of a river system. Dr. Matthews interpreted the quarry to be a river bend. And one reason why we find so many dinosaur bones there is they think that a flood had occurred upstream. Sadly, a lot of the animals didn't make it during the flood, and so their bodies would go downstream and get caught in that river bend. So, along with all the sediment to cover them up and preserve them so we can find them today. Now, as I said, there's all sorts of different environments, and another bit of context we're going to go into is the plants, because plants form a very important part of the environment, as you all know. But sadly, there are no flowering plants because they had yet to evolve. We wouldn't see flowering plants till the early Cretaceous period. So the type of plants we see are more like conifers, ginkgo trees, if you've ever seen a maidenhair tree or a ginkgo tree, ferns, cycads, these unusual plants called Benetalians, forgive me y'all. Also, ferns, clubtails, horsetail plants, and yeah, just a lot of conifers and one type of tree called a monkey puzzle trees. Their early relatives were there. So a lot of greenery, but not much color in terms of flowers or anything because they had yet to evolve. And so that leads us to the animals. Now, of course, there was more than just dinosaurs at the Morrison Formation. There were primitive mammals, pterosaurs, which dinosaur relatives, and of course, there were also invertebrates, fish, crocodilians, all sorts of lizards, and more. And so, to briefly go over the types of dinosaurs you could find before we get to the sauropods, there was also, like I said, famous theropods like Allosaurus. Stegosaurus was also there, and its cousin was Hesperonychus, Ceratosaurus, Camptosaurus, and one particular dinosaur that was found at the quarry, discovered brand new, is Mimorpelta, an ankylosaur, or armored dinosaur. And there's a lot more. There's over, I think, 100 species of dinosaur has been discovered at the Morrison. But first and foremost, were the sauropods, the big long-necked dinosaurs. These were the most common dinosaurs here, which brings up some interesting questions as we get into it. So, what is a sauropod? Well, we all know they're big and long-necked, but there's some very important traits we need to go over. Of course, like I said, they had big, broad bodies, big, long necks, but also importantly, they had small heads with blunt teeth because they were vegetarian. They also, in addition to their long neck, they had long counterbalancing tails. And their feet. Perhaps the most important trait about sauropods was their weight-bearing feet. And as you can see, their forefeet, or hands, were sort of horseshoe-shaped. All their fingers were like this to help maximize their load-bearing capacity. And their back feet, while most dinosaurs were digigrade, being on their tiptoes like this, sauropods were semi-plantigrade, so their feet were kind of almost flat to the ground, kind of like our feet. Because, again, they needed to bear that weight. And as you can see here, this is sort of a close-up of their feet and some tracks to show you an idea of how they would have arranged and walked. But most importantly is their size. Everyone knows that sauropods are bigger than elephants. But that kind of, makes it a little vague about how much bigger are they than elephants. Well, some of the largest sauropods were bigger than a herd of elephants. As you can see here, this is a picture of Argentinosaurus. There's a blue whale next to it. I mean, the blue whale probably weighs more, but they're pretty much the same length. So sauropods rival the whales of today in size. Now, why were they this big? I mean, how did they get this big? Well, there's four major hypotheses about why they were so big. First off, they had hollow bones, especially their vertebrae were hollow. They had special pleurocells, or hollow spaces, that helped lighten the skeleton. So having a lighter skeleton means they didn't have to be weighed down so much. All right, secondly, sorry about that. Secondly, unlike mammals who have to carry their young, or placental mammals who has to carry their young, sauropods laid eggs. Like all other dinosaurs, they laid eggs, and that was much easier, I'm sure. And defense is the third hypothesis. When you have big predators, the bigger you are, the harder it is for them to hurt you and to eat you. So size is a big defense, but the most important hypothesis of why sauropods got so big was because of their digestive system. The bigger and longer your digestive tract is, the more efficient it is, the more nutrients it can get out of the food. The longer your food stays in the digestive tract, the more efficient it is, the more nutrients it can get out of it. So it's sort of like a feedback loop. So sauropods started getting big so they can eat more vegetation. Then they eat more vegetation, they needed more nutrients, so they get bigger. You get the idea. It's sort of like a feedback loop. So next, we're going to get into their anatomy and physiology, and we're going to start with the muscular and skeletal system. So it's important to note, It's important to note that there is a balance between dense, reinforced bones like those in the limbs and hollow, light bones like those in the vertebra. And so you can kind of see that while they were heavily muscled animals, like from this picture here, and how we know about the muscle arrangements is because of the attachment points on the bones. We can get an idea of what the muscles look like. Even though they're massively muscled, they really didn't have to have a lot of muscle to hold up their necks or their tails. They actually had special ligaments that lined the back of their skulls and their vertebrae all the way down to the tail. It's very much like a suspension bridge or a crane, those cables and all that hold, they basically bear all that weight. And the same goes for these ligaments that hold up the weight of the neck and the tail. So They didn't have to have as much muscle holding up like a giraffe. Giraffes have really muscular necks, but they didn't have the hollow bones or the special ligaments to hold those necks up. So they have to have more muscle. But sauropods, though, they became more specialized with that long neck by having the hollow bones as well as the special ligaments. And moving on. So that brings us to their cardiovascular system and their respiratory system. Now, as I said earlier, they did have hollow vertebrae, but there was another special purpose that those vertebrae had. Those pleurocells held what's called air sacs. The air sacs are like extensions off the lungs, making them very efficient at breathing. We see air sacs today in birds, an avian respiratory system, and it was also very efficient. And the way they breathe was essentially unidirectional. In other words, as they breathed in, they also breathed out. So the breath looped through. We mammals have to do bidirectional, where we breathe in, then we breathe out. So much more efficient, and that's good because if they had our sort of breathing system, they would suffocate. They're just so big that they couldn't do it the same way we do. So they have an avian-style respiratory system. Also, those air sacs acted like an air conditioner. Being warm-blooded animals, and we'll get into that a little bit more later, they had to shed all that body heat, otherwise, they'll cook themselves from the inside. So these air sacs also acted like air conditioners. So you've ever seen like a dog panting, or maybe you've seen videos of crocodiles or birds like yawning. That is a thermoregulation behavior to help dump excess heat. And so sauropods probably did the same thing. They probably held their mouth open and probably looked a little derpy, but it helped cool them off. Another important thing is their cardiovascular system. Now, we don't have direct fossil evidence of their circulatory system, but we can make some strong inferences based on, how big they are, and from markers on the bone, just like with the pleurocells. We know that they had to have huge hearts, like really big hearts, probably the size of the hearts that you see in whales, and really thick walls in those hearts to have that powerful pumping to get all that blood throughout the body. And just like giraffes, and we know that there are some of the blood vessels that went through the vertebrae, we see special little pockets where they had special blood vessels that helped regulate the blood pressure, because too much blood pressure, then they can damage the brain. Too little blood pressure, going up that big long neck, then they pass out. So they had special, very elastic arteries and veins to help regulate the blood flow. All right. So now we're going to talk about the nervous system. Now, I bet most of you have just now noticed that they had an awfully small brain, it seems, right? An awfully small brain. And of course, for the longest time, a lot of people thought dinosaurs were stupid because they had a small brain. Well, fortunately, more research has shown that you don't have to have a big brain to be smart. And in the case, just like look at turtles. Turtles have a relatively small brain for their body size, but they still do a lot with that brain. As Dr. Christopher Manis says, a lot goes on in that little space. And so we could presume that even though sauropods had a small brain, they probably had a wide variety of complex behaviors. I mean, I don't think they're going to be doing calculus or something like that, but they probably could get around just fine with that small brain. And of course, you can imagine the nervous system on these guys. So even though they had a small brain, that was they could still get around pretty well. But there's a reason why they had a small brain. Now, I want you to imagine, say you held out a piece of paper like this, with your neck or your arm all sticking out. That's pretty easy to do, right? Now imagine if you had something heavy in your hand and you did this. After a minute or two, you're going to get tired and holding that up, right? So it makes sense that they had a small brain, a light skull on that big, long neck. Otherwise, it would be exhausting just to, keep your head up. Now, last thing I want to say about the nervous system is this particular spot here. It is called the sacral plexus. It is an expansion of the base of the tail and the vertebrae and all that. Now, a long time ago, when dinosaurs were first being studied, some scientists who didn't know no better thought that maybe this was a second brain. They were thinking, well, these guys were probably so big they needed a second brain to control the back end. We now know that's not true. No vertebrate has two brains. But it was what's called a glycogen body. You can see this today in birds. Now, the function of the glycogen body is not totally known, but we think that what it does is it acts as a storage receptacle, a storage place for nutrients for the nervous system. So once again, it makes sense why this expansion is so big. They had a big nervous system, so they need all the support and nutrients they can get. So, biggest takeaway though, it doesn't matter if you have a small brain, you'll still do great. Now, digestive system and metabolism. These are the big things, and we're about to get into why we know that these guys were warm-blooded. But first, as we already stated, the bigger your digestive system is, the more efficient it is at breaking down food, the longer the food stays in the digestive tract to break down and get more nutrients out of it. That's especially true for herbivores. Plants, they're hard to turn into animal tissue. Carnivorous animals have an easier time, so they have a shorter digestive tract because turning animal tissue into animal tissue is easy. But turning plant tissue into animal tissue, that's hard. So you need a big, long digestive tract with plenty of room and nooks and crannies for beneficial bacteria to help break down that food. And in sauropods, we get an idea of their digestive system because of how big they are. We can get an idea in looking at their modern relatives, where their organs are placed. We have an idea of how they may have done it. So they think that they were hindgut fermenters. In other words, they would eat up all the vegetation, let it pass through, kind of like cows and other ruminant mammals. And it would sit in the digestive tract and just break down, probably going for different types of stomachs. It's likely sauropods also had a crop, much like birds today, the little pouch before the stomach to help grind up the food. They used to think they used gastroliths, or tiny little rocks they would swallow to help grind up the food, but we now know sauropods probably didn't do that. Mainly because they're just so big, and having a big crop like that, you don't really need the extra crunch. And so the front end, as you notice that the skulls, their teeth are concentrated in the front. And I'll use this. That makes sense because that allowed them to be more efficient stripping vegetation. These guys didn't spend a lot of time chewing. They didn't really need to. They had to get as much food as fast as possible to power that metabolism. And so they stripped the vegetation, and having their teeth up front allowed them to do that. And we know that from the wear patterns, the tiny little scratches on their teeth. And that gives us an idea of how they could have, chewed on not really chew, but, stripped the plants and leaves and stuff. And so, this is among the many lines of evidence, as we're getting into metabolism, why we know these guys were warm-blooded. First off, they had to have a very efficient breathing system. Otherwise, like I said, if they had something like ours, they wouldn't have been able to breathe. They would have passed out and died from suffocation. They had the adaptations to gather in as much food as possible. Think about it. Warm-blooded animals have to eat a lot more food than cold-blooded animals. Cold-blooded animals, like most of today's reptiles, they're able to go a long time without food because their food breaks down slowly. They metabolize it slowly. But warm-blooded animals, we have to eat constantly or something bad will happen. And so, that, in addition to their growth, these guys grew fast. We'll get into how fast they grew in just a moment. But one last thing before we move on is that in addition to having to eat a lot, having a very efficient breathing system, and just being able to grow very fast, is we can take a look at the bone structure under a microscope. We take a thin slice of bone, put it under the microscope, and we see that it has a special texture. As you know about tree rings, and that kind of tells you an idea of growth. Well, in most warm-blooded animals, while we do have layers, they're all very messy. They're all it almost looks like fabric, woven fabric. And this is called fibrolaminar bone. It shows that bone that grows really quickly, even though it might be in spurts, it it's all messy because they grow so quick. And lastly, you can get a lot of idea of the feeding behaviors of sauropods by looking at how their necks are shaped, how they could have used it. Like Brachiosaurus having a big, long, tall neck, treetops. More diplodocid, like dinosaurs like Diplodocus, they're more horizontal, so they probably grazed a bit more. And then some with a little bit more short necks probably probably limited their feeding area to lower areas. So, we're going to go into reproduction, growth, and development. Like I said, these guys grew fast. So imagine, well actually, we don't have to imagine, we got a little prop here. Imagine a baby about this big, about a pound in weight, or half a kilogram. And then for the first 5 to 10 years of its life, this guy is just eating away, and then all of a sudden, by the time it's like 5 or 10, it's the size of a horse. But then, about between the ages of 5 and 10, it hits a growth spurt. Now, one of the measurements for specifically Apatosaurus, it put on 5,500 kilograms, or a little over 12,000 pounds a year in peak growth. So we're taking something the size of a horse, and all of a sudden it's getting bigger than a herd of elephants. Or, well, actually, yeah. So the size of an elephant, my bad. So 12,000 pounds in a year, and then they kept this growth up until they became an adult. So can you imagine that in a span of less than 5 years, you go from horse size to elephant size, and all of a sudden you're as big as a whale? That's an impressive amount of growth. And these guys, they had a lifespan similar to our own. They reached adulthood around between the ages of 15 and 20, or physical adulthood, I should say. Mentally, I don't think that really counts for them. So, a maximum growth of near 5,500 kilograms a year. That's impressive. Especially when you consider that most sauropod eggs, you'd think they would have rather large eggs, but this guy's actually a little big. They're actually about half the size. Later, when we do a tour of the Sheen collection, you'll see dinosaur eggs and you'll get an idea of how big they are. And they're actually not as big as you would think, which is surprising. And so babies, they would also have an egg tooth to help them break out of egg, just like modern day birds. And we also know that sauropods didn't really take care of their young. So like sea turtles, they would just find a place that was suitable and lay their eggs and then just leave them, using lots and lots of babies to basically take care of themselves. It's a numbers game. Not all those babies are going to survive. Only maybe like 1 out of 100 might become an adult. So they're what they're called R-strategists in terms of their reproduction. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, why they don't take care of their young, because they're so big. I mean, if they tried to stay near the nest, one false move and then, well, you got scrambled eggs. I mean, let's just be honest. I mean, that's it. But also, if they tried to stay in an area, as we went over, these guys grew, so they had to eat a lot of food to keep that growth up. They could have easily deforested someplace if they stayed in one place for too long. So that's probably why they didn't take care of their young like other dinosaurs do. So we're going to get into a little bit of behavior, or at least some speculation about their behavior. As we already said, they didn't really take care of their young. They just dug a hole in the ground and laid their eggs. It's possible they may have done communal nesting where a bunch of sauropods would go to the same place to lay eggs. But again, they probably didn't do a lot of parental care. At most, they may have did some nest guarding, but again, they probably couldn't hang out in the same place for too long because they would eat up all the vegetation and accidents to avoid accidents. So some of the interesting behaviors, based on their anatomy, we can infer is that maybe some probably used their tail for defense. I mean, granted, they're already huge animals, so their entire body could be a weapon. When you're a predator and you're only about a fifth the size of your prey, you're probably going to think twice before trying to take on something that big by yourself. I mean, you can see this guy, he's not having a good day. That tail just smacking him. We do know that sauropods lived in herds. We have massive fossil trackways. They're nicknamed dinosaur highways, especially out west near in Texas, Glen Rose, Texas. There's just these, for miles, there are dinosaur tracks. So we know that they migrated and that they lived in herds. And there was two types of herds. Some looked like they were all around the same. Some of the herd animals were around the same age, and others were mixed age herds where they did have younger animals along with adults. Of course, as I've said earlier, most of their teeth were concentrated in front, so when they bit on their vegetation, they would bite down and they would strip the leaves and other soft parts of the plants. They didn't really chew their food, they just scraped and raked it in, because these guys had to be efficient feeding. They just had to eat as much as they can all at once. So why waste time chewing when you got to get all those calories in? And of course, the big long necks, in addition to assisting in feeding, being able to stay in one place and move your neck around to feed on any plant you needed to, they may have had bright colors, may have had a lot of vibrant patterns. Just like in animals today, they probably had a lot of display structures. Maybe they even had a huge rooster comb like wattles and things like that. And lastly, some sauropods could have gotten into a tripod stance. Like this guy, this little model I have here, he's raised up, if you can see that. Now this may have been to help with feeding. Maybe they could reach up higher into the trees to feed. Or maybe they could have done that to kind of wrestle. Well, males could, almost like sumo wrestlers, wrestling each other over territory or mates. I mean, could you imagine seeing huge animals just wrestle? I mean, that's just incredible. And so, or maybe they just reared up like that to also scare the hell out of any predators that might try to come. So, I mean, I'd be scared. The one stomping, you're out. So, like I said earlier, they may have had a small brain, but we can see from their anatomy, they certainly had some sort of complex behavior going on. Now we're getting into probably the drier parts of the lecture here. We're going to talk about how are they related to other dinosaurs? Where are they on the family tree? And well, sauropods are part of the clade Sauropod morpha, and they're, along with the theropods, are part of the dinosaur family tree, the one side of the dinosaur family tree called Saurischia. And the other side is the Ornithischia, which is a lot of other plant eaters like your duckbills, Triceratops, Stegosaurus, all those guys. And then that side, sauropods and the theropods. And it kind of makes sense why we think that. Well, the earliest sauropods looked very much like the meat-eating dinosaurs. I mean, they had a slightly longer neck. Their teeth were they're much more blunt than the carnivorous teeth, which are more blade-like. So these guys probably start as small, bipedal, with slightly longer necks, omnivores. And as they evolved and all that, you can see the second stage, sort of a second grade, I should say. They had much longer necks. They were still bipedal, but they were getting bigger. Now, this guy is basically called Plateosaurus, and there was a group called prosauropods, or informally called prosauropods, which are sort of like the in-between of the earliest sauropodomorphs and true sauropods. And so again, as you can see, they're still digigrade at this stage too, so they're still stopping on their tiptoes. But as they evolved larger sizes, their feet started becoming more adapted for weight bearing, and so there's becoming more plantigrade. So you see they're still getting the long neck, they're getting bigger, and down here with true sauropods, their feet are fully weight bearing structures. They can no longer grasp with their hands anymore, they just became feet. And again, like I said, the longer neck, longer tail, and they're just getting bigger. And so this is the sauropod family tree. And the ones we're going to focus on specifically are these guys, the ones highlighted in yellow, the diplodocids, the chimaerosaurs, and the brachiosaurs. Those are the ones I got to work on when I went out to Utah. So, to give you an idea of what these are like, sorry y'all, I gotta get through my cards. Crap. My apologies, everyone. Alright, well. Like I said, I apologize, everyone. My cards got scattered, and so I'm a little scattered. Okay, so this is a Apatosaurus. It is a diplodocid, and one feature about diplodocids is that they held their body more horizontally, posture-wise. Their back limbs were a lot taller, a lot longer than their front limbs. So think of your classic Brontosaurus. And in fact, this is actually a close cousin of Brontosaurus. The bone I got to work on in Utah, that's a femur. And that's me laying to. That's like a rite of passage for paleontologists to lay down next to a femur or some other large dinosaur bone. And so this guy was the most common dinosaur at the Utah quarry. The bones of this animal was everywhere, and this was the only adult specimen there. All the rest of them were juveniles. And so that comes to the iconic Brontosaurus. Very similar to Apatosaurus, very similar. In fact, they used to think they were one and the same animal. In 1903, a paleontologist named Elmer Riggs, when he was studying the different species of sauropods that were discovered out west, he thought that even though these guys were given different names, they thought they were the same animal. So for the longest time, they thought Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus were the same animal. Turns out they were separate. And as you can see, I must make this disclaimer, non-avian dinosaurs did not live with humans. They did not. The Flintstones did not happen. I'm sorry, I know that's sad. Probably for the best. So we're going to go into the differences between Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus. And as you can see, generally, Apatosaurus was a bit bigger, much more robust. He was the big brother, I guess you could say. Well, Brontosaurus was smaller, a little bit more gracefully built. Another thing that these two animals have in common with their necks was that their necks were much more robust compared to the necks of other sauropods. And it's thought that maybe they engaged in what's called necking. You ever seen male giraffes slam their necks together? Well, it's possible that these sauropods may have did the same thing. And as you've seen in the previous slide of the two wrestling, maybe that's when they did their necking, was when they started wrestling, slam their necks against one another to see who would win. So more differences between Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus is their pelvises. Brontosaurus had a wider hip up towards the top, while Apatosaurus had a much narrower hip. And also, their neck vertebrae, you can see here that the chevrons coming off of are much more closer together, they're much more narrow, while in Apatosaurus they're much wider out. But you can still see how these are still very similar, and it's easy to think why Dr. Riggs thought they may have been one and the same. But now, since 2015, we've done a more detailed study, and we found that, yeah, they are separate with these differences. Now next is perhaps one of the most famous dinosaurs of all, or at least worldwide, is Diplodocus. Diplodocus is like your classic long-necked dinosaur that's not Brachiosaurus. Very long neck, very graceful neck. But what's particular about these guys, like with other Diplodocids, is they had this really long tail. I mean, their tail was longer than their neck. And the tip of their tails was whip-like. Now, it is thought that perhaps they could use their tails as a defense mechanism, use it as a whip against predators. They may have also used their tails as a communication device amongst others in their herd. Sort of think of it like a flag or something along those lines. Now, they did think, some scientists thought that maybe they could whip their tails strong enough to where they could break the sound barrier like a cracking a whip, but nowadays, more analysis showed that they couldn't quite do that without really hurting themselves. So while they could still use their tail to smack something, they're probably not smacking something that hard. It's hard enough to hurt either way. But yes, Diplodocus is famous mainly because it was the first dinosaur to have a mount made from replicas of their fossils. There is a famous, it's called a prefab Diplodocus called Dippy that's at the Natural History Museum in London. It was the first dinosaur to have basically fake bones. They used fake replicas of the bones to make the mount instead of using the real bones, because everybody wanted a Diplodocus skeleton at that time, and so they figured out a way to make copies of the fossil, or replicas I should say, sorry. I don't want to give the wrong impression there. But this was basically the first dinosaur to have prefabricated mounts. And that was great because that way they didn't have to use the real bones, which could get damaged. And, well, there's always people that wants to nick a piece of dinosaur bone because they don't respect boundaries. So this goes to the cousin Barnosaurus. No one really talks about this guy too much, so I'm going to give him a little love and talk a little bit about him. Barnosaurus, for a diplodocid, had the longest neck out of any of them. So while Diplodocus had a rather long neck and a rather long, even longer tail, Barnosaurus took the neck and ran with it even longer. It's makes up almost more than 50% of its body. I mean, you can see from the skeleton diagram here how much longer its neck is. And it could have been, they used their necks not only just to help with the feed, they mostly likely used them for social display. Like, hey, look at my big long neck, y'all. So, Dinosaurs, like I said, it is the longest necked diplodocid out of all. And now here's my favorite sauropod, Camarasaurus. Camarasaurus, along with Apatosaurus, is the most common sauropod found in the Morrison. In fact, I think it's more common, though we didn't see as many when I was out in Utah and other places like in Colorado, like Como Bluff. These guys, you find them everywhere. And what's special, why they're my favorite sauropod, is remember how I said earlier that their skulls were lightly built. So a lot of times we don't get to find the skulls of sauropods because they're so delicate and light that they get broken and lost and eroded away easily. But Camarasaurus, on the other hand, unusually had a much more robust skull. This is a replica. And as you can see, much more robust teeth, much more robust skull. So they have a lot of complete skulls of Camarasaurus. And so that could tell us a lot about the brain. You know, we could do a CT scan, look inside the skull, see how big their brains was. I mean, Camarasaurus has taught us a lot about how sauropods process their food. And as I said earlier, while a lot of sauropods didn't even bother with chewing, Camarasaurus is sort of the exception. Their teeth show dental wear patterns that suggest that they did a little bit of chewing. Kind of like if you've ever seen an iguana eating a salad. They kind of do that, just chopping sort of chew. Well, Camarasaurus did that on a bigger scale probably. And even more excitingly, here at our school, at the fossil collection we have in Peoples, we have a Camarasaurus bone. This bone came from one of their humeruses, or their front arm, their upper arm bones. So we actually have an example of this guy in our collection. Like I said, they're my favorite because they're just so common and we've learned so much. We've even got a complete skeleton of a juvenile, from the last bone in the tail, the skull, all of it. And of course, the most, perhaps even more famous than the Diplodocus, you've all seen this guy, Brachiosaurus. It was perhaps the largest sauropod that lived in the Morrison. There's a couple of other contenders that are not as well known as Brachiosaurus, but everyone knows who Brachiosaurus is. Very much like a giraffe and how it held its neck up really high up. It had a small little bit of bone, looks like a bump on its head. Probably had maybe some sort of inflatable sacs there, so when a male's displayed to a female, they'd pump those up like a bird's and display like, hey, look at this, And so, another thing about Brachiosaurus and Camarasaurus, to a smaller extent, is that their front limbs were a little bit longer than their back limbs, giving them that slope to their body, that sloped look to their bodies. Though this, I don't know why the artist kind of, made the skeletal drawing a little bent in a little bit, but that's okay. We're not here to criticize art. But they had this sloped body just like a giraffe, and so from that posture, we can speculate that they probably, their niche was probably treetop browsers, and they actually have the skeleton here. I don't know why I didn't use it. But you can see, again, the neck has these really long, sort of rib-like extensions that helped keep the neck up. Their necks were still flexible. They were still flexible enough to, to drink water. They couldn't do the little leg splaying thing like giraffes because, well, they're so big that they would be unstable, they would fall over, and that would be bad for everybody, especially for anything that was underneath the poor thing. And, well, these guys, as you've seen, you know what scene comes up after this scene in Jurassic Park. They didn't rear. They did not rear up like this because their front end was too big, too long in the forearms and all that, so their center of gravity was closer to their shoulders. They may have briefly was able to lift up just a little bit, but they couldn't rear up like that. They weren't built for it. But the Diplodocids, though, were able to build like it because they had much longer limbs in the back and much wider hips that helped them get in a tripod stance. And like I said, everybody knows who Brachiosaurus is thanks to Jurassic Park. And that's it.